Dr. Valentina Reyes had been chief of psychiatric medicine at Hargrove Ellison Medical Center for 3 years when her brother's name appeared on her department's admission board. It was a Tuesday morning in late October. I was halfway through my second cup of coffee, standing at the nurse's station on the seventh floor, reviewing the overnight intake log the way I did every morning, not because I had to, but because I had built the habit so deep into my body that skipping it would have felt like forgetting how to breathe. The board refreshed at 6:15. I watched the names roll in the way you watch familiar traffic on a road you've driven 1,000 times. And then I saw it. Marcus Reyes. Date of birth, March 4, 1981. Admitted via emergency psychiatric hold at 11:47 p.m. Attending physician, Dr. Priya Subramaniam, second-year resident, still 4 months from her boards. I set my coffee down on the counter without looking at it. The cup tipped slightly. A nurse named Gloria Ferreira caught it before it fell. I didn't thank her right away. I was reading the chart number. I was reading the unit assignment. I was reading the room number. Room 714. My unit, my floor, my department. Marcus had been admitted to my hospital, my ward, under my authority, and he didn't know it yet. He had no idea who ran this department. He had no idea who would be signing off on every clinical decision made about his care. He had no idea, when he woke up that morning in a hospital bed with a paper bracelet on his wrist, that the sister he had erased from his life, from all of their lives, was the chief of psychiatric medicine standing 40 feet down the hall. I recognized his name before he could have recognized anything about where he was. I closed the intake log. I picked up my coffee. I told Gloria I'd be in my office if anyone needed me. I walked down the hall slowly, the way I always walk, not because I was calm, but because I had spent the last 15 years learning that your pace is the first thing people read about you, and I had no intention of letting anyone in that hallway read a single thing I hadn't chosen to show them. I sat down behind my desk. I opened the chart, and I read every word. Hello, everyone. Before I continue, if you have ever been told you would never amount to anything by someone who should have believed in you, leave a comment below. I want to hear your story. I mean that. Because what I'm about to tell you took me 20 years to live through, and I spent most of those years thinking I was the only one carrying something this heavy. I know now that I wasn't. I know now that some of you are carrying versions of this right now. But to understand why that Tuesday morning meant what it did, why seeing that name on the board hit me the way it did, I have to take you back. 10 years back. Farther, even. I have to take you back to the night my brother stood in my mother's kitchen and told a lie so complete, so carefully constructed, that my entire family believed it without asking me a single question. I was 26 years old. I was living in a one-bedroom apartment in Tucson, Arizona, paying $740 a month in rent with a roommate named Carla who worked nights and slept through my alarm clock. I was working as a patient care technician at Desert Valley General Hospital on the psychiatric floor, not because it was glamorous, not because anyone in my family understood what I did there, but because I had known since I was 19 that psychiatry was the field I was going to spend my life in, and I was willing to start at the bottom of it if that was what it took. My mother's name was Rosario. My father had passed when Marcus and I were teenagers. After he died, Rosario Reyes became the family's center of gravity, and Marcus became the person who managed that gravity. He was 4 years older than me. He was charming in the specific way that people who have never been seriously challenged tend to be charming, easy with a joke, comfortable at a table, fluent in the language of people who want to be agreed with. He had worked in real estate since he was 22. He had a good car. He had a loud laugh. Our aunts loved him. I don't know exactly when he decided I was a threat to him. I've spent a lot of time in therapy sessions thinking about that question, and the most honest answer I've arrived at is this. I don't think Marcus ever thought of me as a person with interiority. I think he thought of me as a supporting character in his story. And when I started making decisions that didn't serve his narrative, he adjusted the narrative. It started with the inheritance. When my father died, he left behind a small estate, a house in Albuquerque, a life insurance policy, and a joint savings account that had accumulated, over 30 years of careful living, $87,000. His will, drawn up by a local attorney named Gerald Whitfield of Whitfield and Associates, divided the estate evenly between Marcus and me, with the house to be sold and the proceeds split. That was the plan. That was what the document said. That was what my father had intended. Marcus had a different plan. He told my mother, in the weeks after the funeral, while I was still in Tucson working overnight shifts and trying to understand that my father was gone, that I had borrowed money from my father without telling anyone. He said the amount was $43,000. He said I had never paid it back. He said my father had mentioned it to him more than once, had been embarrassed to bring it up with me directly, and had trusted Marcus to handle it after he was gone. There was no loan. There were no documents. There was no record of any transfer. When I asked Marcus to show me the financial disclosure, he said it had been an informal arrangement. When I asked my mother if she had ever heard my father mention it, she said she didn't know, that she couldn't remember, that it wasn't the right time to be arguing about money. My Aunt Carmen said, "Valentina, why would Marcus lie about something like this?" My Aunt Dolores said, "Your father worked so hard for that money. If you borrowed it, you need to do the right thing." My cousin Raphael didn't say anything. He just looked at his shoes. I was 25 years old, working as a patient care technician, living with a roommate named Carla, and my family was looking at me like I was a thief in my own father's house. I asked Gerald Whitfield, the estate attorney, whether I had any grounds to contest the claim. He told me that without written documentation of the alleged loan, the claim was legally weak, but that pursuing it would require time, money, and a family law attorney, none of which I had. He said gently that these situations were unfortunately common, and that sometimes the cost of fighting was higher than the cost of letting go. I let go of $43,000. I let go of my share of what my father had built. And I let go of something else too, the version of my family where someone might have said, "Wait, let's ask Valentina her side." Nobody asked. I drove back to Tucson on a Sunday afternoon in February. I stopped at a gas station outside of Socorro. I sat in my car for 22 minutes. I did not cry, because I had already used up all the crying I had in me during the 6-hour drive down. When I was done sitting, I went inside and bought a bottle of water and a notepad. I sat back in the car, and I wrote down the name of a program I had been researching for 3 months, the Psychiatry Residency Match Program at the University of New Mexico Health Sciences Center. I folded the paper in half. I put it in my wallet. I kept it there for 6 years. I did not call my mother to tell her I had applied. The rejection letter from UNM arrived on a Thursday in early March. I remember the exact quality of the light in the apartment, flat and gray, coming in sideways through a window Carla had taped a towel over to block the morning glare. I read the letter twice. Then I folded it and put it in the same kitchen drawer where I kept my lease agreement and my health insurance coverage documents and the photocopy of the certification I had earned the previous spring. I did not call Marcus. I did not call my mother. I did not tell anyone. What I did was go to work. I worked the 3 to 11 shift on the psychiatric unit at Desert Valley General, and I watched Dr. Amadou Diallo, the attending who ran the evening program and who had, over the previous year and a half, become the first person in any professional context to treat my clinical instincts as something worth paying attention to, run a group therapy session with 8 patients who ranged from actively psychotic to cautiously stabilized. I watched how he moved through the room. I watched how he listened. I watched the specific way he adjusted his posture when someone said something that mattered. Afterward, in the corridor outside the unit, I told him about the rejection. He asked me 2 questions. The first was, "Did you apply anywhere else?" I said I had applied to 3 programs and been rejected by all 3. He nodded. The second question was, "Do you want to hear what I think, or do you want me to just tell you that it'll be okay?" I said I wanted to hear what he thought. He said, "Your clinical instincts are not the problem. Your application is the problem. You don't have research experience, you have no publications, and you have 1 letter of recommendation from someone I've never heard of. Those are fixable problems." He said, "Come back next year. Between now and then, I'm going to introduce you to someone." The someone was Dr. Constance Ibarra, a research coordinator at the UNM Department of Psychiatry, who was running a longitudinal study on early intervention in first-episode psychosis. She needed research assistants who had direct patient care experience and who could read a medical records database without flinching. Dr. Diallo made a single phone call. I had a meeting with Dr. Ibarra within 2 weeks. I worked for Dr. Ibarra for 14 months without pay. I worked my regular shifts at Desert Valley. I drove to Albuquerque on my days off, and I sat in a windowless office entering data, flagging inconsistencies in patient records, and slowly, incrementally, learning what research in psychiatry actually looked like from the inside. During those 14 months, my mother called me 4 times. 3 of the calls were about Marcus, his new listing in Scottsdale, his engagement to a woman named Patricia, the family dinner I should come to so I could apologize properly and we could all move on. The 4th call was to tell me that Aunt Carmen had been diagnosed with a heart condition and had seen a specialist in Albuquerque, not a psychiatric specialist, a cardiologist, and that I should call her. I called Aunt Carmen. I did not go to the family dinner. I did not apologize for anything. When I reapplied to the Match program the following year, I had a co-authorship credit on a preliminary paper, a strong letter from Dr. Ibarra, and a letter from Dr. Diallo that I read once before sealing the envelope and never read again, because he had shown me a draft, and it had used words about me that I wasn't prepared to sit with at the time. I matched at Meridian University Medical Center in St. Louis Psychiatry Residency, 4 years. I called Dr. Diallo at 7 in the morning and left a voicemail that was mostly me not saying anything for a few seconds, and then saying thank you. He called back that afternoon and said, "Good, now go." I didn't call my mother until I was already packed. Meridian University Medical Center was a teaching hospital with 600 beds, a Level 1 trauma center, and a department of psychiatry that ran one of the more rigorous residency programs in the Midwest. I arrived in July. I moved into a 2-room apartment on Lindell Boulevard with a desk I had bought flat-packed and assembled on the floor of the living room because I didn't own a screwdriver yet. I bought a screwdriver. I built the desk. I went to orientation. The program director was Dr. Raymond Okafor, a Nigerian-American psychiatrist who had trained at Johns Hopkins and who ran the residency with the combination of absolute precision and genuine investment in his residents that I would later come to understand was exceptionally rare in academic medicine. He introduced himself to the incoming class by saying, "I am not here to make you comfortable. I am here to make you excellent." I wrote that down in the notebook I kept during the first week of orientation. I still have that notebook. My first year was what first years in psychiatry residency are always described as being total immersion, sleep deprivation, and the sustained experience of being wrong about things you were certain about. I made mistakes. Some of them were minor. One of them was not. In my 3rd month, I missed a contraindication in a medication adjustment for a patient who had been admitted following a manic episode. The patient was 62 years old, presented with a complex medical history, and had a cardiac condition documented in his medical records that I had read but not weighted correctly against the pharmacological decision I was recommending. Dr. Okafor caught it during rounds before the order was signed. He pulled me aside afterward. He did not raise his voice. He said, "Walk me through your reasoning." I did. He listened. Then he said, "Where did your reasoning break down?" I found it. He waited while I found it. Then he said, "Write it up. What happened, why it happened, what you should have done, and what you will do differently. Bring it to me by Friday." I brought it to him by Thursday. He read it in my presence. He handed it back and said, "This is the difference between someone who learns and someone who doesn't. Don't make me have to teach you this lesson twice." I didn't. By my 2nd year, Dr. Okafor had assigned me to work alongside Dr. Farida Mensah, the senior attending who ran Meridian's inpatient psychiatric unit, a 48-bed ward that served the full range of acute psychiatric presentations, from first-episode psychosis to treatment-resistant depression to complex trauma cases. Dr. Mensah was 51 years old, had trained at the Maudsley in London, and had the kind of clinical authority that communicated itself without ever being announced. She taught me how to run a unit. Not just how to treat patients, how to run a unit. The staffing, the documentation, the way you manage a team at 2 in the morning when 2 patients are in crisis simultaneously, and you have to decide where you stand. In October of my 3rd year, Meridian's residency program submitted a case study to the Journal of Psychiatric Practice co-authored by Dr. Mensah and 3 residents, of whom I was one. The paper was accepted in February. I remember the morning Dr. Mensah forwarded me the acceptance email. I was sitting in the residence lounge at 6:40 a.m. eating a granola bar. I read the email 3 times. I sat very still for a moment. Then I ate the rest of the granola bar. I thought about calling my mother to tell her. I thought about it for approximately 45 seconds. I didn't call. By that point, the family's silence had calcified into something that no longer surprised me. Marcus had gotten married. There had been a wedding I was not invited to. My cousin Raphael had texted me a photo, not of the wedding, just of himself at the reception, grinning at the camera, with a caption that said, "Miss you cuz." I had saved the photo. I had not responded. I did not know how to respond to a message that acknowledged my absence without acknowledging what had created it. I completed my residency in June. I was 29 years old. Dr. Akaffer shook my hand at the graduation ceremony and said, "Don't disappear." I told him I had no intention of disappearing. He said, "Good, I'll be watching." The following month, I accepted a position as a staff psychiatrist at Hargrove Ellison Medical Center in Chicago, a 420-bed academic medical center affiliated with the Dalton University School of Medicine. Starting salary, $196,000. I signed the offer letter on a Wednesday evening at my kitchen table in the apartment on Lindell Boulevard. The desk I had built on the floor 3 years earlier was still there. I sat at that desk and I signed the letter, and I thought about the piece of paper I had kept in my wallet for 6 years, the one with the name of a program written on it in gas station notepad handwriting. I had transferred it from wallet to wallet for 6 years. I took it out that night and I unfolded it. The paper was soft at the creases, gray with handling, barely legible. I held it for a minute. Then I folded it back up and kept it. By the time I had been at Hargrove Ellison for 4 years, I had built something that I found difficult, even in private, to fully take in. My caseload had grown from the standard attending allocation to something that included the hospital's most complex dual diagnosis presentations. Patients whose psychiatric conditions were intertwined with substance use disorders, traumatic brain injuries, chronic pain syndromes, and the kind of treatment histories that made other attending physicians quietly route their referrals toward my office. I had not asked for that reputation. I had earned it by being the person who answered her pager at 3 in the morning and who did not leave the unit until she understood what was happening. In my 5th year at Hargrove Ellison, the outgoing chief of psychiatric medicine, Dr. Harold Steinberg, who was retiring after 22 years in the department, recommended me to the hospital's executive leadership as his successor. He made this recommendation, he told me later over coffee, not because I was the most senior candidate or the most politically comfortable choice, but because he had watched me handle a situation 18 months earlier that had no good options, and I had chosen the least bad one with a clarity and speed that he said he had not seen in a psychiatrist of my age since he had been that age himself. The situation involved a patient who had been misdiagnosed by 2 previous treating physicians, whose insurance policy had been structured in a way that had created a gap in her mental health coverage, and whose case had become entangled with questions about medical records access and a family dispute over her treatment decisions. I had spent 11 days untangling it. I had consulted with a healthcare attorney named Marcus Whitley of the Dalton University Legal Affairs Office. I had personally called the health insurance coverage coordinator at the patient's insurance provider 4 times before I reached someone who had the authority to approve the exception I needed. I had documented every step. The patient had been stabilized. The coverage gap had been resolved. The family dispute had been redirected to the hospital's patient advocacy office. Dr. Steinberg had been watching from the doorway of my office the afternoon I closed the file. I was appointed chief of psychiatric medicine at Hargrove Ellison Medical Center in September, 3 years before Marcus's name appeared on my admission board. My full title was chief of psychiatric medicine and director of inpatient psychiatric services. The department I now ran had 61 staff members, a 32-bed acute inpatient unit, an outpatient clinic with 11 attending physicians, and an annual operating budget of $14.3 million. The person who celebrated with me that night was Dr. Farida Mensa, who had driven up from St. Louis for the occasion. We had dinner at a restaurant on Michigan Avenue. She ordered a bottle of wine she described as being significantly outside my budget, which is why I'm making you split it. We sat at that table for 3 hours. She told me about the first time she had run a unit by herself. I told her about the piece of paper in my wallet. She said, "Do you still have it?" I said yes. She said, "Good, keep it." I told Farida, over that dinner, everything. I told her about the $43,000. I told her about the estate attorney and the family law questions I had never pursued. I told her about my mother's phone calls and the wedding I hadn't been invited to and the text from Raphael and the 6 years of silence that had not been silence on my end, but had apparently registered as silence to everyone who mattered to them. Farida listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Has anyone in your family ever asked what you do for a living?" I thought about it. I said, "My mother knows I'm a doctor. She told Aunt Carmen I work in a hospital. I don't think she knows what kind." Farida said, "And Marcus?" I said, "Marcus thinks I'm probably still in Arizona." Farida picked up her wine glass. She said, "That's going to be quite a day." I said, "Yes." She had no idea what I had become. None of them did, and I had every intention of keeping it that way. The first sign that the distance was about to collapse came 8 months after that dinner, on a Friday afternoon in late June. I was in my office reviewing the department's quarterly performance report when my assistant, Dina Park, knocked twice and opened the door. She said, "Dr. Reyes, I have a call for you. The caller says he's your brother. He says it's about your mother." I looked at the report in my hands. I looked at Dina. I said, "Put it through." The line clicked. I heard Marcus's voice for the first time in 7 years. He said, "Valentina." Not Val, not Tina. He said my full name the way people say a full name when they are uncertain what reception it's going to get. I said, "Marcus." He said, "Mom had a fall. She's in the hospital in Albuquerque. They're saying she needs a specialist appointment, some kind of neurological evaluation. I thought you might, I didn't know if you were still in medicine, but I thought I'd try." The room was very quiet. I could hear the ventilation system in the ceiling. I could hear, distantly, the sound of the unit outside my office door. I said, "I'm still in medicine." He said, "Okay, good, can you help?" I had come that close to everything surfacing before it was time, but it wasn't time yet. I told Marcus I would make a call. That was all I said. I did not tell him what I did for a living. I did not tell him what my title was, or what hospital I worked at, or that I was, at that moment, sitting in the office of the chief of psychiatric medicine of one of the top academic medical centers in the Midwest. I said I would make a call. He said thank you in a voice that had something unfamiliar in it, a roughness, a hesitation, and I said I would be in touch, and I ended the call. I sat with the phone in my hand for a moment. Then I set it on my desk and I looked out the window at the lake, which was gray that afternoon and moving in the way it moves when the wind is coming in off Michigan at an angle. My mother had fallen. She was 67 years old. She had lived alone since Marcus had moved to Scottsdale, which meant she had been alone in that house for years, and apparently no one had put in place the kind of monitoring or support plan that a woman of her age, living alone, should have had. I knew what fall risk looked like. I assessed it in my patients' families. I had never once thought to assess it in my own. I called Dr. Linda Osei, a colleague of mine, a neurologist at Hargrove Ellison who had trained at Northwestern and who had, over the years, become one of the 2 or 3 people in the hospital whose clinical judgment I trusted without qualification. I explained the situation in 3 sentences. She said she knew a good neurologist in Albuquerque, a colleague named Dr. Samuel Nkosi at Rio Grande University Medical Center, and that she could make a direct referral. I said please. She said she'd send it through that afternoon. I said thank you. I then did something I had not done in 7 years. I called my mother. She answered on the 3rd ring. Her voice was smaller than I remembered it. She sounded like someone who had recently been frightened. She said, "Valentina." She said my name the way you say the name of something you thought you might not get back. I said, "Hi Mom, I heard you fell, I'm glad you called Marcus." She said, "I didn't know who else to call." I said, "I know, I've set up a specialist appointment with a neurologist in Albuquerque. His name is Dr. Samuel Nkosi. You'll hear from his office tomorrow morning." There was a silence. Then she said, "You can do that." I said, "Yes." She said, "Are you still in medicine?" I said, "I am." She said, "Marcus said he wasn't sure." I held the phone. I kept my voice exactly where it was. I said, "The appointment will be arranged. I'll follow up in a few days to make sure you have everything you need." She said, "Valentina, are you angry with me?" I thought about how to answer that. I thought about it for 4 seconds, which in a phone call is a long time. Then I said, "We'll talk when you're feeling better, Mom. Right now let's focus on getting you the right care." I ended the call. I sat at my desk for another minute. Then I opened my quarterly report, and I went back to work. What Marcus didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that the call about my mother had arrived in the same week that I had received a certified letter from Gerald Whitfield's successor at the firm now known as Whitfield, Cabrera and Sloan. The letter was about my father's estate. Specifically, it was about a probate matter that had resurfaced following a routine audit of a jointly held investment property that my father had owned with a business partner in 1998, a property whose sale proceeds had never been fully documented in the original estate settlement. The letter was not addressed to Marcus. It was addressed to me. I had already forwarded it to my attorney. Her name was Patricia Delgado Kwon, and she was a partner at the firm of Solis, Delgado Kwon and Marsh in downtown Chicago, a firm that specialized in estate litigation and financial recovery, with a secondary practice in what Patricia described, at our first meeting 3 years earlier, as institutional accountability work, which is a polite way of saying we help people retrieve what was taken from them through documentation rather than drama. I had found her through the Dalton University Legal Affairs Office, the same office I had used when I needed help with the patient coverage situation that had led to my appointment as chief. I had gone to her not about my father's estate, not at first, but about a separate matter involving a physician in my department who had misrepresented his credentials on an institutional financial disclosure. She had handled it cleanly, quietly, and without any of the theater that these situations tend to attract when the wrong attorney is involved. Afterward, over coffee in her office, she had asked me if there was anything else she could help me with. Something in how she asked it made me understand that she was not asking about another administrative matter. I told her about the $43,000. I told her about Gerald Whitfield's original advice, and the estate settlement, and the alleged loan that had no documentation. I told her about the investment property. She listened with the particular quality of attention that I associated with people who were building a case in their head while the other person was still talking. When I finished, she said, "How old were you when you signed the settlement?" I said 25. She said, "Do you have the original will?" I said I had a copy. She said, "Bring it next time." Over the following 3 years, Patricia Delgado Kwon had been assembling a picture. The investment property was the piece she had been waiting for, a concrete, documentable asset whose proceeds should have been included in the estate settlement and were not. The audit had surfaced a discrepancy of $31,000, separate from the original $43,000. Patricia said we now had a figure, a document trail, and a legal basis for reopening the estate. She said we were ready to file whenever I decided. I had not decided yet. I was waiting. I did not know exactly what I was waiting for, but I have learned to trust my sense of timing. It is the same sense I use on the unit, the sense that tells you when a patient is ready, when the moment is right, when pushing now will close a door that needs to stay open. When Marcus called about my mother, I understood. That was the moment. Not because of strategy, though there was strategy, but because something clarified. He had called me for help. He had called me because, whatever version of me existed in his mind, he believed I might still be useful to him. And I realized, sitting at my desk with the lake going gray outside my window, that the version of me that existed in his mind was approximately 20 years out of date. I called Patricia Delgado Kwon that evening. I told her to file. She said she would have the first document ready within 48 hours. I said that was fine. I signed the retainer amendment electronically at 10:15 that night, sitting at the desk in my apartment, with a glass of water and the piece of paper from my wallet unfolded on the surface in front of me. There was no going back. In the 2 weeks that followed, I moved through my days at Hargrove Ellison with the same pace and the same routine. I ran morning rounds. I supervised the residents. I attended the executive leadership meeting on the second Tuesday of the month and presented the department's quarterly metrics, which were good. Inpatient length of stay was down 4%, and the outpatient clinic's no-show rate had dropped to its lowest point in 3 years. The CFO, a man named Douglas Park, said, "Whatever you're doing over there, keep doing it." I said I would. On the outside, nothing had changed. On the inside, I was doing what I had always done in the moments that mattered most. I was being very, very still. Patricia had filed the initial petition with the Bernalillo County Probate Court. The estate was technically still open, a procedural anomaly that Gerald Whitfield's successor had flagged in his letter, which meant that the new documentation could be introduced, without requiring a full reopening. Patricia had also requested a financial disclosure from Marcus in his capacity as the estate's informal executor, a role he had assumed without formal appointment, which itself turned out to be a procedural problem he had apparently never considered. She sent me the filed documents on a Thursday morning. I read them at my desk during my lunch break. The language was precise and dry in the way that legal documents are precise and dry, and the figures were laid out clearly. The original settlement, the alleged loan, the investment property discrepancy, and the total amount that Patricia calculated was owed to me under a corrected distribution. The number was $89,400. I read it twice. Then I put it in the file I kept in my desk drawer, the same drawer where I kept my department's emergency protocols and the printed copy of my employment contract. Then I ate lunch. The close call happened on a Friday afternoon, 12 days after I had signed the retainer amendment. My phone rang while I was walking from the inpatient unit to the outpatient clinic. The caller ID said it was Marcus. I answered. He said, "Hey, I wanted to touch base about Mom." The neurologist was good. She saw Dr. Nkosi and he said the fall wasn't related to anything serious, just a balance issue they can address with physical therapy. So thank you for that. I said, "I'm glad." He said, "Listen, I've been meaning to ask, did you get any kind of letter recently? From an attorney's office? Something about Dad's estate?" I stopped walking. I was in the corridor between the main building and the clinic annex. There was a window to my left. I looked at the window for 1 second. Then I looked back at the floor and I said, "I did get something. A notice about an audit, some procedural thing." I kept my voice completely level. "Did you get one too?" He said, "Yeah, I'm not sure what it's about. I've got someone looking into it." I said, "That makes sense. These things usually work themselves out." He said, "Yeah, probably. Okay, I'll let you know if I hear anything." I said, "Thanks for the update on Mom." I ended the call. I stood in the corridor for 3 seconds. Then I walked to my office, closed the door, and sent Patricia a text that said, "He's been notified. He doesn't know what he's looking at yet. Move the filing timeline up if you can." She responded within 4 minutes, already on it. Hearing date moved to the 14th. That was the moment I understood exactly how much they had underestimated me. The person who kept me grounded during those 2 weeks was not Patricia, and it was not Farida, though I spoke to both of them regularly. It was a patient on the inpatient unit named Clara. I won't use her last name. A woman in her late 40s who had been admitted following a severe depressive episode, and who was, by the time I had known her for 3 weeks, one of the more clear-eyed and quietly funny people I had encountered in a long time. She didn't know anything about my situation. I knew everything about hers. That asymmetry is the nature of the work, and I had long since made peace with it. But one afternoon, during a session she had with her primary resident, Dr. Priya Subramaniam, who was also, by that particular Tuesday in late October, 3 weeks away from being the first person to see Marcus Reyes's name on an admission board, Clara said something that I happened to overhear as I was passing the room. She said, "The thing about being invisible for a long time is that when you finally become visible, people act like something strange has happened. But nothing strange has happened. You were always there. They just weren't looking." I kept walking. I wrote that down when I got to my office. The estate hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday. Marcus flew in from Scottsdale the night before. I know this because he texted me. He had started texting me with a frequency that I recognized as the frequency of a person who senses that something is in motion and is trying to establish normalcy, to say he had landed, and that maybe we could get coffee before the hearing. I said I might not be able to make it before, but I'd see him there. He arrived at the Bernalillo County Courthouse at 9:15 with a woman I didn't recognize, not his wife Patricia, but a younger woman in a gray suit, who turned out to be an assistant from the real estate firm he had retained to handle the estate's property documentation. He also had an attorney, a man named Ronald Hess of the firm Hess and Bennying, who had a pleasant manner and a set of documents that were, as Patricia would later describe them to me, thin. I arrived at 9:20 with Patricia Delgado Kwon. My mother was not there. She was still in Albuquerque, still in physical therapy, still receiving the follow-up care that Dr. Nkosi's office had arranged in coordination with my assistant at Hargrove Ellison. I had made sure she was comfortable and cared for. I had also made sure gently through a phone call the previous week that she understood there was a legal matter being addressed and that she did not need to be present. She had said, "Is Marcus in trouble?" I had said, "There's a process happening that's about Dad's estate. It's been a long time coming." She had gone quiet. I had told her I would call her when it was done. I saw Marcus from across the corridor. He saw me. He smiled, a little uncertain, a little reflexive. He said, "Val." He had never called me Val in my life. He said, "You look." He looked at Patricia standing beside me, her briefcase in her hand. He said, "Is that your attorney?" I said, "Yes, this is Patricia Delgado Kwon." Patricia extended her hand. She said, "Good morning." Marcus looked at her. He looked at me. Something moved behind his eyes, not understanding yet, but the first edge of it. He said, I didn't know you had an attorney. I said, I've had one for 3 years. The hearing room was small, a formal space with a judge's bench at the front, a long table in the center, and seating along one wall. Probate hearings in New Mexico are not public trials. But there were people in that room: the judge, Honorable Diane Castellano, a court clerk, Patricia and her paralegal, Ronald Hess and his assistant, Marcus, and in the back row, two people I had not expected. My Aunt Carmen and my cousin Raphael. I didn't know who had told them. I suspected Marcus had, the night before, expecting, I don't know what he had expected. Backup maybe, moral weight, the comfort of witnesses on his side. What he had not expected was that I had been in that room, in different forms, for 3 years. Patricia presented the case in exactly the order we had discussed. She began with the original will, my father's actual document, drawn up by Gerald Whitfield, filed in 1997, dividing the estate equally between Marcus and me. She presented the original settlement agreement, signed in 2003. She presented the documentation of the alleged loan, specifically the absence of any documentation. She noted, for the record, that the claim had been made verbally, that no written agreement existed, that no bank transfer records supported the figure of $43,000, and that the estate attorney at the time had advised both parties that the claim was legally unsubstantiated, but that neither party had formally contested it at the time of settlement. Then, she presented the investment property. The property was a commercial lot in Rio Rancho that my father had co-owned with a business partner named William Fuentes from 1998 until his death in 2002. The property had been sold in 2004, 14 months after the estate settlement, for $212,000. My father's share, 50%, had been $67,000 after the partner's portion and the sale costs. That money had been deposited into an account in the name of the estate. It had not been distributed, it had not been disclosed. It had been held and then, over the following 2 years, transferred in 6 separate transactions into an account in Marcus's name. The room was very quiet. Patricia said, "That is the first document, I have 3 more." Marcus's attorney, Ronald Hess, said, "I'd like a moment with my client." Judge Castellano said he could have 5 minutes. Marcus turned to look at me across the table. His face had done something I had not seen his face do before. Not anger, not the easy confidence I had watched him deploy my entire life. He looked like a man who has walked into a room expecting it to be one size, and found that it is another size entirely, and his body does not know how to occupy the new dimensions. I looked back at him. I did not look away. I kept my hands flat on the table. He said quietly, so quietly that I'm not certain Ronald Hess even heard it, "How long have you known?" I said. "Patricia found the property records 2 years ago. The audit surfaced the transfer documents." He said, "Val, it wasn't." I said, "Marcus, stop." He stopped. In the back row, I heard my Aunt Carmen make a sound. Not a word. Just a sound, the sound of something landing that cannot be unlanded. Patricia presented the second document, the bank transfer records, obtained through the probate court's discovery process, showing the 6 transactions over 22 months. The third document was a financial disclosure that Ronald Hess had submitted on Marcus's behalf 3 weeks earlier, in which the investment property proceeds were not mentioned. The fourth document was a letter from Gerald Whitfield's successor at Whitfield, Cabrera and Sloan, confirming that the omission of the investment property from the original estate settlement had not been authorized by the estate attorney and had not been disclosed to all beneficiaries as required under New Mexico estate law. Judge Castellano read the fourth document without expression. She set it down. She said, "Mr. Hess, does your client wish to respond to the substance of these documents, or would he prefer to discuss a consent agreement?" Ronald Hess said, "We'd like to discuss a consent agreement." Marcus did not look at me during that exchange. He was looking at the table. His hands, I noticed, had gone very still. At 10:47 in the morning, Judge Castellano set a date for a follow-up hearing and noted for the record that a consent agreement was being pursued by both parties, with a resolution framework to be submitted within 30 days. She confirmed that the estate remained open pending final distribution and that all contested amounts were under court supervision. As we stood to leave, my cousin Raphael stood up from the back row. He looked like he was going to say something. He looked at me for a moment, then he sat back down. I picked up my bag. Patricia touched my arm briefly, just once, just for a second, and said, "You did well." I said I hadn't done anything. She said, "That was the point. We walked out into the corridor. The Albuquerque morning was very bright. I stood in the sun for a moment with my eyes closed. I thought about my father. I thought about the 30 years he had spent building $87,000 from careful living. I thought about the piece of paper in my wallet. I called my mother from the parking lot. She answered on the second ring. I said, "It went well. There's going to be a legal settlement. Patricia will explain the details when everything is finalized. You should know that Dad's wishes are going to be honored the way he intended." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I didn't know, Valentina." I said, "I know, Mom." She said, "I should have asked." I said, "Yes." She said, "I'm sorry." I said, "I know." I got in my car. I drove to the airport. I flew back to Chicago. That was 14 months ago. The consent agreement was finalized 33 days after the hearing. The legal settlement, entered as a court order in Bernalillo County Probate Court, required Marcus to return to the estate the full amount of the undisclosed investment property proceeds, adjusted for interest under New Mexico estate law, which brought the total figure to $74,260. That sum was divided equally between Marcus and me under the terms of the original will, meaning my share of the corrected distribution was $37,130, which combined with a renegotiated portion of the original $43,000 dispute, resolved separately through the consent agreement at $22,000, brought the total amount recovered to $59,130. I put $20,000 of it into a retirement account. The rest I held in reserve. Marcus did not contest the consent agreement. Ronald Hess advised him not to. The reputational exposure of the financial disclosure discrepancy, in a field where Marcus worked in real estate and relied on institutional trust, was a consideration that Patricia had raised with Ronald Hess in their initial conversation, quietly and without drama. The way these things are done, when the person you're representing has already won and is simply waiting for the other side to understand that. He called me 3 weeks after the consent agreement was signed. He said, "I need you to know I didn't plan it from the beginning." I said, "I know." He said, It was a small thing at first." I said, "It was never small." He said, "No, I know, you're right." There was a pause. Then he said, What are we now?" I said, "I don't know yet. I think that depends on what we both decide to do with the next few years." He said, "Okay." I said, "Okay. I don't know what Marcus and I will be to each other in 10 years. I don't know if my mother and I will find our way back to something that resembles the closeness I wanted from her when I was 25, and driving back to Tucson with 22 minutes of stillness at a gas station outside of Socorro. I hope we will. I am not certain we will. Both things can be true. What I know is that 3 weeks after that phone call, Marcus Reyes was admitted to the 7th floor of Hargrove Ellison Medical Center on a psychiatric hold. That his name appeared on my admission board on a Tuesday morning in late October. That Dr. Priya Subramaniam flagged his chart and came to my office and knocked on my door and said, "Dr. Reyes, I have a patient in room 714 who says he's your brother." That I looked at the chart. That I called Dr. Linda Osai to ask her to consult on the neurological component. That I recused myself as his direct attending because that is the correct clinical and ethical decision, and I make correct clinical and ethical decisions, and that is not going to change because of who the patient is. And that I walked into room 714 anyway, not as his physician, as his sister. He was sitting up in the bed. He looked smaller than I remembered. He looked like someone who had arrived somewhere he did not know how to leave. He looked at me and he said, "They told me the chief of this department was the attending on my case." I said, "I've recused myself, you'll have a different attending." He said, "But the chief," he looked at me. His face did what it had done in the courthouse corridor, that recalibration, that shifting of dimensions. He said, "It's you." I said, "It's me." He said, "How long?" I said, 3 years as chief. 15 years in psychiatric medicine total." He said, "I told them you were probably still in Arizona." I said, "I know." He looked at the ceiling for a long moment. Then he said, "Are you going to help me?" I said, "You're in the best psychiatric department in the Midwest. You're going to get excellent care. Tending assigned to your case trained under one of the best clinicians I've ever worked with. You're going to be fine." He said, "That's not," he stopped. He started again. He said, "I mean, are you going to help me, you not the department?" I sat down in the chair beside his bed. I said, "Yes." We sat like that for a while, not saying much. The unit was moving outside the room the way it always moves, the steady, necessary sound of a place that does not stop for any one person's story. I had built that place, it was mine, and for the first time in a very long time, I let someone from my family sit inside it. He was discharged 22 days later, stabilized, with a follow-up plan and a referral to an outpatient practice and a prescription that Dr. Subramaniam had managed carefully and well. I reviewed the discharge summary. I signed off on the continuity of care documentation. I did my job. The last thing he said to me before he left was, "I didn't know who you were." I said, "No." He said, "I'm sorry." I said, "I know." I went back to morning rounds. I had 7 patients to see and a department meeting at 2 and a resident who needed feedback on a case presentation she was nervous about. My life was full. It had been full for years, built piece by piece in the specific and invisible way that things are built when no one is watching and no one is helping, and the only person who has to believe in you is you. I think about that gas station outside of Sakaro sometimes. I think about the 22 minutes. I think about the piece of paper which I finally, on the night the consent agreement was signed, took out of my wallet for the last time. I didn't throw it away. I put it in a frame. It's on the wall of my office at Hargrove Ellison, behind my desk where I can see it from my chair. The handwriting is barely legible, but I know what it says. And if there's anything this experience taught me, it's this. 1. The work you do in silence, when no one is watching and no one is counting, is the only work that belongs entirely to you, and it is the only work they cannot take. 2. Documentation is not about distrust, it is about the long, patient truth, and the truth, when it is complete and witnessed and signed, does not need you to argue on its behalf. 3. You are not who your family decided you were at 25, you are who you decided to become in every year that followed. And those years are yours, entirely, regardless of whether anyone in that family ever understood what they were watching. Was I wrong to keep my career hidden from my family for 15 years, while the legal case was building, instead of confronting them the moment I had the resources to do so? Tell me in the comments. If this story gave you strength, hit that like button. It means more than you know.